I want to talk about today, informing the reform of public education, actually draws on a collection of activities I've been involved in going back now over 20 years, and in some sense sets the stage for work that I hope to be able to do while here at Stanford. Let me begin by setting some context for the situation that I think we find ourselves in today. I believe, from the point of view of thinking about this period of educational history, we live in extraordinary times. By that I mean, if we think about the system of public education that most of us went through, this was a system of education that was wrought in the passage into the 20th century in a set of extraordinary forces: urbanization, immigration, the beginning of industrialization in the American economy. That system of public education came about as a result of that set of forces, and it constitutes what my colleague David Tyack has described as the one best system of public education. It's what we've known. It's been in place for 100 years or so. We're now in another one, I would argue, of these great historical moments. We've seen this shift from an industrial economy into a post-industrial, an information age. We now have this massive immigration occurring in our cities, and actually in places like California across the whole state, which has been a very rapidly rising phenomenon. In my old city of Chicago, which historically for 40 or 50 years has been a predominantly African-American public school system, Latino enrollments have been rising by 3% a year for the past 10 years, so that by 2010, Latinos will be the dominant, single largest group in that public school system. But again, it signals sort of enormous changes that are occurring. And then there's this big whale of technology that has transformed virtually every workplace except schools. And that transformation is coming. What it looks like is something for us to create, but in my mind, it's clearly coming. You put all these big social, economic, cultural forces together with what now we're asking for, a new goal: ambitious academic attainment for all children. What historically perhaps we only desired for 10 or 15% of our population, we're now asking for all of our children. You put these forces together, and we're really in a period of recreating a whole new set of institutions, I would argue, within public education. This is not just new programs tinkering on the margins, but really a call for fundamental institutional change. The signs for this are everywhere. Literally every element of what we think about as the public education system, what we've taken for granted, is now under intense scrutiny. Who gets to teach? What is taught? How schools are organized? Who gets to run schools? What role should the government play? There literally isn't an element of the system that most of us were educated in that is not under intense debate, where someplace across this land you can find kind of novel experiments going on in alternative ways of addressing these questions. It's truly a profound period we live in. It's inconceivable to me that as we think about all these changes that are occurring out there, and this desire to have schools that are not just incrementally better, but fundamentally different, that we could have such change without a serious renewal of the work we do in universities, how we go about developing people, and the tools, materials, and ideas that those people work with. We're part of that institutional fabric. If every other aspect of the institutional fabric is being challenged and questioned, those questions rightfully need to come home to the university as well. All right. As we think then about how to move forward, I have to begin with a set of organizing beliefs. First of which is this idea that good research, good scholarship, broadly defined, can and should stand in a more productive relationship to practice and policy to improve practice. Second, also another organizing belief that the basic institutional arrangements of public education, schools of education, and the connections between these two are part of the problem that has to be confronted. We're not going to fix this by just putting more resources into the existing system or working a little bit harder, just trying to do things a little bit different. The institutional arrangements just don't work the way they should. So we need to invent new forms of work, just as we're inventing new ways to develop teachers, new ways to organize schools, experimenting with new governance arrangements for public education. We also need to think about different ways of organizing the connection between universities and schools. So, at the core of the vision of this work is a need to deepen the connection to educational practices and improvement. We need to have stronger ties to practice and improvement here at the university, and simultaneously we also need to strengthen the capacity at the university to engage in sustained research and development. I'll talk about the engineering work of innovations for school improvement in order to advance these practices. So we need to be more strongly connected to practice, and we also need to have a different kind of research and development capacity internal to the university. Let me talk a little bit about, just kind of a little bit of background, the current state of educational research and development. When I say development, I mean both developing people and the tools, materials, and ideas they work with. So this is a shorthand for both of the two major functions. What do we do in a university? We educate people, and we work on the tools, materials, and ideas that those professionals take into their practice. All right. What do we know about the current state of educational research and development? Well, comparatively speaking, this is a very underfunded, under-resourced enterprise. In fields such as medicine and engineering, research and development typically represents somewhere between 5 to 15% of overall expenditures. In 2003, the R&D budget in education was 0.25%. So this is a very under-resourced enterprise. When we decry the weaknesses in educational research, to some extent, we get what we pay for, and we simply haven't invested in research and development. On the other hand, when we think about those ambitious academic goals for all children, the extraordinary changes that we're talking about needing in our educational system, it's inconceivable to me that we could get there without a much more vital research and development enterprise in education. Most educational research is conducted in universities, which tends to place very high priority on individual contributions to new knowledge. You know, that's how people get tenure, that's how they get promoted, that's how they get recruited from one university to another. What individual contribution to new knowledge have you created? Participation in collaborative, larger scale efforts tend to be less valued. It's harder to sort out the contribution, so we tend to counsel, particularly junior faculty, away from that work. And the culture and incentives are also not conducive to, again, this idea of doing the engineering work, of really working on innovations, in some sense polishing the stone, trying to make them actually be capable of working in a wide range of contexts. That kind of engineering work is also less valued. Research, as a result, developed in the academy tends to be more directed toward other researchers than practitioners. The institutional mechanisms and incentives for collaboration between research and practitioners are modest at best. And this has a consequence that often the good theory that gets developed in the academy doesn't get carried through into actual usable innovations. And actually the good innovations that are often developed in practice don't get systematically studied and refined through research. And so we kind of lose on both ends of this equation. Problems, however, are not just peculiar. Again, this is an institutional design problem. So part of what we see in the academy is also a reflection of the way the other aspects of that I would call the institutional triangle here works. Practitioners have little access to educational research relevant to the day-to-day challenges. That's true. But they also are very little incentives for them to actually engage research. It's not part of their pre-service preparation programs. It's not typically part of their professional development work. And the dominant dominant practice is to look inside one's own classroom for learning. So it's very much a private conception of how one learns. And unfortunately, what is learned there sort of lives and dies with the individual. It tends not to be collectively shared, and we tend not to build on it. So we've got a set of norms inside of practice that are really not particularly productive in terms of actually trying to engage research. And then finally, there's the third piece of this triangle, in addition to the culture of schooling, the culture of the academy, is also to pay attention to what goes on in the commercial sector. Because much of the innovations that go into schools come through things that schools and districts buy. And so the commercial sector plays a very large role in how innovations move into schools. Unfortunately, the marketing decisions that tend to occur in the commercial sector are often much more shaped by the political realities of coping with state and district approval mechanisms than norms of sustained evidence-based improvement. So in a sense, the market doesn't really work as a constructive agent or as constructive an agent for advancing school improvement as we would like, because the incentives tend to be a bit distorted here. So taken together, this tends to create a situation, as you look across the incentives in terms of the way each of the institutional actors work and how they interconnect with one another, it creates a situation in which school districts are dominated by faddish reforms, often with little evidence warranting their use, and even as they take on innovations that may have some merit, there tends to be little sustained or systematic attention to learning from those innovations. Political decisions tend to focus much more on what looks good, adopting the currently popular reform initiative rather than what I would call on doing good, having identified a set of innovations, working on trying to make them work and systematically analyze their effects. All right. So that's the kind of state of the current practice. What might a new vision of research and its connection to practice look like? There's a growing recognition in our field that we need a new research and development infrastructure to support school improvement. Generally, these accounts tend to have they share several key principles. The first of which is that an R&D infrastructure should really be built around the pressing problems of practice in school settings and actually finding solutions to those problems. Now, this seems like an eminently sensible idea, but as my talk will proceed, virtually nothing in our field is organized that way. Much of the research that we do is organized by particular disciplinary interests, advancing certain kinds of methodologies, lots of different reasons, but it tends not to be organized in this fashion. Okay. A couple of major reports that have been released over the last few years that have called for this new vision. One was a report of the National Academy of Education that was released in 1999, and it called for programs of use-inspired research. And the key elements of this use-inspired research in the NAE report was this idea that it should address broad, real-world problems. It should engage researchers and practitioners in sort of co-development of the problem and efforts at solving these problems. That there should be a long-term commitment to this work, that inevitably this kind of work, like engineering work, you try something, it fails, you redesign it, you try it again, that there is this process of continuous refinement and improvement, and that in the process of doing that, we not only need to build things that work, but we need to try to be real clear about why they work, so to articulate the underlying principles behind the reform, because one of the key problems we always have to confront in education is this adaptability of any innovation to a local context. And if you don't deeply understand the principles that undergird the innovation, those local adaptations can often be fatal because you change something that's actually at the center of the innovation and you don't know it. Okay. That was the NAE's report. Another report, this one by the National Academy of Sciences that came out in 2003, the Strategic Educational Research Initiative. Their argument was that currently there's no institution in which educational practitioners and researchers from a variety of fields can interact with one another and actually collaborate. Researchers, as a result, as I mentioned before, often fail to bring their understandings to the point of actually some usable innovations, and innovations that develop in the field don't actually get systematically tested and shared with others. So, again, arguing for a need for a new R&D infrastructure. So to kind of sum up what this, in sort of big elements, what this R&D infrastructure might do is it would have an agenda organized around the core problems of practice. It would focus on innovations that are co-developed, finding ways in which researchers and practitioners can engage in this work over longer periods of time in these kind of repeated processes of trying things out and refining them. And it would couple an engineering orientation toward adaptability in local context, to actually make this a direct object of study rather than seeing issues of local implementation, or typically local implementation failure, as something that those people out there didn't do right, which is typically the way these things tend to get framed in the academy, rather than seeing issues of local adaptability as an essential part of the engineering problem. All right. Taking this vision, thinking about, in some sense, stepping back, my earlier work in Chicago. I arrived in the University of Chicago in 1985. And shortly after I got there, I was very much interested in trying to create a center of work, recreating a center of work between that university and the Chicago Public Schools. There had been a long history of involvement of faculty at the University of Chicago with the Chicago Public Schools, and more generally with the city. That university grew up in the turn into the 20th century. It was in that period of industrialization, urbanization, mass immigration, and social scientists at that university were very much a part of thinking about the problems of the city, and much of the social sciences, as we know it in the United States, began at the University of Chicago with faculty engaged in the problems of the city. So that great intellectual tradition was certainly an inspiration to beginning to think about how we in the university could engage the very serious problems confronting the Chicago Public Schools. Shortly after I arrived there, this was, I guess, 1987, then the U.S. Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett, came to Chicago, landed on the tarmac at O'Hare, held a press conference, and looked out across the city and said, "Worst public school system in America." And it was, it was one of those interesting things that, well, we could have had a contest about it because Chicago is bad, but we could have probably put Cleveland, Detroit. I could have probably put at least Newark, at least a half a dozen other places, maybe Oakland, if I knew more about California at that point, into the same category. But clearly there were very serious problems. And the question really became, well, what could we do? What would an ambitious center of work at a university do that if we could stay the course over a period of time, raise enough money to bring a group of people and stay the course, what would something that might conceivably operate at $3 to $4 or $5 million a year do to leverage what actually was occurring in a $5 billion a year enterprise called the Chicago Public School System? What would we do? What kinds of program of work? What kinds of people should we bring together? What new relationships would be needed? And how would we manage this kind of internal work of what became a very diverse colleagueship of expertise? Well, part one of this was to anchor our efforts in the work of teachers, principals, and community leaders trying to improve their schools. Part of the context of this, Chicago was in the midst of a decentralization initiative. It had created local school councils that were working, that consisted of parents, community members working with teachers and principals. And so there was a lot of action occurring at the school site that seemed like a constructive place to engage. But, I mean, as we thought about why it was so important to do this work, first of which was we had to establish the legitimacy for our collective enterprise, coming from the university, trying to actually engage in work in urban public schools. On more than one occasion in those first few years, as we began this work, we'd have conversations of the form, well, you're from where? And you want to do what? I mean, research universities had largely pulled out of the problems of urban school districts in the late 60s, early 70s. And by 1985, it was mid-1980s, when we were starting this work, you couldn't really find any major research university around this country that had a really large center of work with a big urban public school district. Things had shifted more toward doing work on a national level, with national data sets, and this kind of work directly with an urban district was hard, and it was thought to be low-status work, that you didn't, this was not a good place in which to do one's academic work. So part of what we had to do is reestablish the legitimacy of the university for engaging this kind of work. Second, we thought it was important to build usable knowledge about efforts to improve urban schools, you had to be fully engaged in the work. If you weren't there working alongside teachers, principals, in schools on a very regular basis, there was a good chance you really didn't understand what the work was about. And so that became a second key consideration. Thinking about it strategically, we thought if we stayed the course long enough, we'd have a grassroots strategy for building leadership. We'd work with teachers, principals, school community leaders. These individuals would eventually grow in their influence. In the case of the school professionals, they'd move up into the system, and we'd create over time a constructive force for change from the grassroots up. So that would become one part of a Pincer strategy. And for our more academic work, this day-to-day work in schools literally became the intellectual lifeblood for everything else. It became a kind of another voice on our shoulder, in addition to our disciplinary voice, our methodological voice, our policy voice, to be able to understand these problems as teachers, principals, school community leaders understood them. Out of this emerged the work of the Center for Urban School Improvement, and in that work eventually led us to start a North Kentwood Oakland charter school. We were one of the very first universities to take on the sponsorship of a charter school. North Kentwood Oakland was initiated in 1996. By the time I left, the University of Chicago had agreed to accept a second charter school, Donahue School, which just opened this September, and plans are now underway for the university to sponsor a network of up to 5 charter schools across the mid-south side of Chicago, including plans for a high school, which will open in 2007. So this idea that you needed to be doing the work, and especially from the point of view of a university, it's wonderful to develop these ideas about what other people should do. But when you have to make the ideas work in your own school, that's the real test of what you know. And I can tell you, it's a very humbling experience. I know a lot of things that don't work and a modest number of things that do is what happens to that. But that was the important part of the work, to be deeply involved in that work on a day in and day out basis. Second part of this, what I call this Pincer strategy, the first part was kind of grassroots, being deeply involved in the day-to-day activity of transforming schools. And the second part of this was to really try to build a classy applied research capacity to inform reform. What we wanted to do is to use the Research Act as a convening context for bringing people together, for raising questions about what was or wasn't happening with regard to school reform in the city, and for assembling the best possible evidence we could gather for informing these subsequent debates about what should happen next to advance reform in the city of Chicago. That our issue was really trying to advance the collective conversation, advance the collective understanding about what was or wasn't happening and what would need to happen next if reform was going to continue to move forward. Out of this emerged a second institution called the Consortium on Chicago School Research, which continues to operate. And part of the reason why so much, if you read about urban school reform, so much about urban school reform is actually written about Chicago is because of the existence of that institution. And it has created a huge, one of the largest, I think it is actually the largest integrated database that exists anywhere on following students' academic development longitudinally. I mean, the consortium has literally the results of every item administered to every student in the Chicago Public Schools test item from 1987 forward. So it has complete access to all of the administrative databases of the system. It has a survey system that every 2 years, repeated surveys, special topics, but also certain strands that get repeated over time. We built geocoded from using address files, information about the small neighborhoods where students live, right down to where all the brown spots were, where all the liquor establishments are located, what the crime rates were, but this very extensive community data, but really trying to build this extraordinary resource that could be used to constantly study the effects of various reform initiatives in the city. And again, this idea was sort of grassroots leadership from the bottom up, working on the civic elite, trying to understand better what's happening with regard to the school system, and eventually pressing this enterprise from both directions simultaneously. All right, projecting forward, the Stanford opportunity for new leadership, reinventing how a research university works with schools. It was this, the possibility of doing this, that actually brought me here. And the inspiration for this I take from Daniel Burnham. Make no little plans, they have no magic to stir men's. And if Burnham were writing now, he'd say women's blood. And little did Daniel know when he wrote this, if you know, Daniel Burnham was one of the great architects of the city of Chicago. He was the architect for the Columbian Exposition, and if you've read Devil in the White City, he's one of the central character in Devil in the White City. It's a very engaging book. But anyway, little did Daniel know that in modern times he would be described as having a genuine BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal of make no little plans, so they have no magic to stir men's blood. That was the Columbian Exposition of 1893 that was quoted about. At any rate, make no little plans. Well, we would try to build a research and development institute at Stanford that actually would be focused on improving schools. What would be the organizing principles for such an institute? First of which, I would argue, is it needs to vitalize a new mission. We need to attract the best and brightest of talent, academic, clinical, and the business sector, purposely brought together to design and carry out a focused and sustained program of problem-centered R&D. It's problem-centered R&D, and it also draws on a much broader expertise base than we normally think about in the academy, where we have tenured faculty and everybody else. Second, it needs to actualize a new organizational culture that recognizes the distinctive contribution that each individual brings to the R&D program, and where all participants embrace a collective commitment to advancing productive solutions on the problems of practice. If I'm working on a problem of the redesign of a very dysfunctional high school, a principal who's actually done that work in a disadvantaged urban district knows a hell of a lot more about that, certain parts of that problem, than I do. And I need to recognize and value that. In the academy, the clinical staff tend to be second-class citizens. But if I'm doing problem-centered R&D, that expertise is just as essential as the expertise I bring to the table. And we need a context in which that norm is valued. Work needs to operate with a considerable internal autonomy, but that autonomy has to come in exchange for genuine external accountability to advance improvement. Now, internal autonomy inside the academy seems like a given, but certainly if you're doing this research in a context, and it has to be done collaboratively with the public school system, that internal autonomy is not a given. And the public control of research enterprises is a very creates a very unstable set of arrangements. So staff of the Institute need to consult broadly in detailing the precise nature of the problems and potential solutions to these problems, but they also need considerable freedom to carry out this kind of work. An institute should be judged over time, not just simply by the number of academic publications it produces, but are we actually making progress on redressing the problem of practice that the institute was designed to address? So in that sense, to make our research and development enterprise actually accountable for improvement, supporting improvement. Another core principle. It needs to be constituted with necessary resources and authority to design and carry out the R&D initiatives. We're going to commit to a program of research and development on some problem. This is going to require long-term support, and it's got to be support around advancing work on the problem rather than around just a series of discrete individual projects. It's also going to be essential to figure out how to establish and maintain ongoing collaborations with individual classroom teachers and whole school sites, which function as the initial, what I call these alpha development contexts for trying out new ideas. Our resources need to be provided for that as well. And this kind of co-development work with schools is really a fairly novel activity, which is going to raise a whole set of issues around districts and state policies, collective bargaining agreements. There's a whole structure in the way schools operate that don't really support research and development. And if this is going to happen, we have to figure out how to redress these problems. Key among these is if we have long-term relationships with a set of school sites, in some sense those schools have to be buffered from the policy churn that characterizes districts. My own work back in Chicago, we were doing some work with a number of schools around literacy, primary literacy instruction, developing some new assessment systems. Income's reading first. The state decides everybody's going to do dibbles, and they're going to have to use this new Basel series, and the work just gets eviscerated right in front of you. Got to figure out how to buffer this research and development enterprise from that kind of policy churn so that good ideas have a chance to be developed. Part of what actually strikes me as we talk about this more in the discussion section, may turn out to be a much more productive way of doing this is actually in the context of collaborative work with charter management organizations. Charter schools and the organizations that run them, by virtue of just the way they're set up, tend to be more buffered from this kind of activity. And the internal incentives, trying to get it right because they want to grow, is much more consistent with the kind of R&D work we want to do than a system that's much more concerned about minimizing potential problems than maximizing its ability to improve over time. But that is an issue that has to be worked on. All right. That's thinking about it in an organizational sense. What's the substantive focus? The kind of big problems meriting attention. Well, obviously at the core of this is the redesign of schools. How do we actually create schools where more ambitious academic work can occur for all children? Second big consideration is, well, schools tend to exist in districts. And how do we redesign central offices so that these kinds of schools where ambitious academic work is occurring, well, you'd like to have more of these schools. And that means taking on several big issues in central office redesign. Kind of great irony about schools. Schools, talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes. Schools are human resource intensive enterprises. They're only as good as the people who are in them and their capacity to work together. If you thought about this as your business, and the core of your business is the quality of your people and their capacity to work together, if you're running a lot of schools, you would think that you would make your human resource development system a real focus of your attention, because how good your schools are only as good as your people. And yet when you look inside of districts, these are one of the most kind of poor, it's like a backwater. There's hardly any attention to it, even though it's right at the core of what we do. So reinventing human resource development systems for schools. Informing continuous improvement. We want schools to become more evidence-based, but this is all new work. And how to build systems of what good evidence is and how individuals would use them, and how we transform the cultures, not just of how teachers think about their classroom practice, how principals operate their schools, but how districts operate as learning enterprises. All of that is extraordinary new work that has to occur. And, of course, we're talking about managing change on a scale that we have never seen before. So, huge work in redesigning central offices and districts. A related set of issues, but but also quite different, the startup and growth of charter management organizations. These organizations are about the business of starting new schools. This is, again, a relatively new enterprise about which we know relatively little. Lots of organizations are doing it. They're learning things out there, but we're not learning from what they're learning. Similarly, we have the organizations that are sponsoring these schools. They're growing, and many of these are still relatively new entities, and they're now beginning to confront the problem of moving from the schools that the founders can directly touch to beginning to operate at a more geographically dispersed area. They're becoming larger in size, And there is this kind of natural implementation dip that one can expect to occur at this point as you go from what you can directly touch to building an organization that can operate at a much larger scale. Trying to understand what those problems are in the growth of charter management organizations is really a key to supporting that work occurring much more effectively in the future. And then finally is this issue, again, picking up on the work, my earlier work of the consortium, of civic engagement. For better or worse, we have a public school system that's controlled through democratic polity. Quality of the decisions we will get are only going to be as good as the kind of collective intelligence of our society about issues of schooling, education, and the design of the systems to advance that. And so how do we continuously engage in informing genuine reform? All right. Now, let me step back from those big problems and put them into somewhat larger context. As I said before, education is a human resource-intensive enterprise. Schools are only as good as the quality of their people and their capacity to work together. Now we have a big problem. K-12 schooling in the United States does not get its fair share of our nation's human resources. When you look at the statistics on who are our education majors, they're among the lowest of any occupation. Moreover, even of those who go into teaching, the most academically able are the most likely to leave early on in their careers. This is a huge problem. Standing behind this, why does this problem look the way it is? Teaching is a low-status occupation in the United States. And in this regard, when we compare the United States to other developed countries, we really lag behind. This is not true for most of the countries that we think about as our economic competitors. Teaching is not a low-status occupation. So the real issue here is not the absolute amount of money we spend on education, but what this money buys or fails to buy. When we look, there are a variety. The economists of education are fond of pointing out that, the United States spends more on public education per pupil than just about any other country in the developed world, which is true. However, if you look at what we spend on education relative to the proportion of the gross domestic product, we're actually among the lowest of the development world. Because that's a much better indicator because it tells you where the human resources in our society are going. In other societies, the fair portion of high-quality human resources are going into public education. That's not true in the United States. And now we're talking about more ambitious academic work for all kids in an enterprise that's human resource intensive. And in a big macro sense, we're just not getting our share of the human resources. It just seems inconceivable we could have fundamentally better schools unless somehow we solve this problem. Well, the implications seem clear. Teaching must become a more attractive profession. And, if we handed this problem over to a business leader and, you're not getting the quality of people you need to run your business, typically you'd immediately start to think about two things. Well, we've got to do something about the career salary opportunities for the people we want to employ. And two, we've got to make the conditions under which people work more attractive. Because salary attracts people into a profession. What do the possibilities look like for my life if I go into education? And work conditions keep you there or encourage you to leave. So we have to jointly solve these two problems. But we got another problem. This would seemingly require a huge infusion of new dollars. And as we look into the future, where the competition for public resources are going to be, the competition is going to be ferocious by all accounts. We have rapidly rising healthcare costs and many individuals who are uninsured, a system that seems to be out of control. We have underfunded public retirement obligations, which are huge. And then we have all this other stuff about which we are really uncertain, terrorism and defense needs and so on. While it's essential that we press the case for increased educational funding, it also seems essential that we need to think about this issue. Is there a way that we could make education more efficient while at the same time being more ambitious as to what we're after? That's a tough problem because even just making it more efficient, holding the goals constant, is a hard problem, and we're both ratcheting up the goals and asking questions about can we be more efficient in advancing those goals at the same time. Well, this suggests a couple of significant R&D priorities to think about. Part of the cost structure of schools is really deeply set in the egg crate arrangement. A classroom with a teacher and 25 kids. And once you've got that structure, and if you take that structure as given, then every teacher's got to be pretty good, and the teachers who aren't good, you've got to hide someplace. And as long as you take that as given, the cost structure is largely determined, because the largest single element in the cost structure are teachers. Now, can we reinvent the work of teachers? That's what that begins to suggest. Can we think about new roles? Because remember, we've got to make teaching more attractive. So we've got to create ways for recruit good people into the field and stay in the field. And the other problem, even good people, they stay in education, they leave the classroom. So we've got to figure out a way to recreate the career ladder for teachers, which means, among other things, there's got to be something like a senior teacher for whom the salary rewards are substantially higher than what we currently afford. But if we do that, we've got to also figure out where are the economies in this enterprise. And so can we start to think about maybe a different structure where we have teams, where we have senior teachers and junior colleagues and maybe clinical interns or Teach for America, and they're working together, a group of teachers with a group of students with shared responsibilities over some period of time. Could we make something like that work? So we're redesigning the work of senior teachers, just as in other fields, the work of doctors have been redesigned, and many of the things that doctors used to do are now done by nurses or done by other technicians. Could we actually change the work of teaching so that it no longer looks like this kind of flat profession where everybody does basically the same thing? A senior teacher collects milk money just like a Teach for America person does. And they're likely to reproduce their own Xeroxes on the Xerox machine in school just like anybody else does. This is really a waste of talent to structure the work of teachers in this fashion. It fails to recognize the expertise that people have and really say, what are the critical tasks that our most senior teachers need to work on, and how do we redesign the work so that they do that, so we get maximum value from what they know and can be able to do. So that's one priority. Can we think about the redesign of school in these ways? Second big priority, as I alluded to before, is transforming the work of teachers through technology. What we know about technology introduction into other workplaces is technology has basically done one of two things. It's taken routine tasks, things that can be proceduralized. They follow an if-then logic, and it's automated them. So a lot of the back offices that used to hire large numbers of white-collar people, many of those activities are now automated through technology. Well, if you spend any time in schools, teachers, others just routinely decry all the paperwork that we do. You know, this is a place where technology could presumably be a big assist. So reducing that kind of routinized work that follows a procedural if-then logic, of which a lot of occurs in schools is of that form, schools seem ripe for that. The second way in which technology has transformed other workplaces is in work practices which are not amenable to this kind of proceduralization, but where it's brought more information to bear more rapidly, organize that information in ways that informs complex decision-making. Well, this sounds like, when we talk about the reflective practice of that we want teachers to develop and maintain in their classrooms, that is complex work that should be informed by evidence. That evidence needs to be brought to bear more rapidly. It needs to be assembled in ways where I say the analysis, or the display is the analysis. These are the kinds of things technology can help us with. So to think about how to transform teachers' work through technology. Now, this is another place where, unfortunately, we tend to have a market failure. There's lots of efforts to develop technology, but it tends to be of some distinct form. Some of it comes from technologists. I've developed this whoopsie-doo new software or tool, and if you only figure out how to use it, your life will be better. Well, that tends not to work very well in schools. So the things that emerge in the technology sector, then they get picked up and then they get dropped because actually making it work in schools is the heart of the work. How do we actually make these things work in schools? So we got problems over there that we have difficulties in that domain. We have districts now increasingly buying things, but much of what they're buying is really driven by it's the current hot thing, or it's driven by it's going to get my test scores up by June, and it's not an investment in really trying to fundamentally improve the way individuals work. We have a group now, it's actually a group I started at Chicago, that I still work with, that is really thinking about this problem. But I think we're thinking about it in a different sort of way. We're starting with the work of teachers, staff developers, and asking, well, what are the common problems in the work they do? And are there places in this work where if we design some new tools and social practices for their use, we could actually add value to the way they do the work? I'll give you an example. One of the problems we've been working on is work with school-based staff developers and primary literacy programs. And I call this the Ask Leanne problem because there was someone on our staff who was a resource to a set of literacy coaches in a set of schools in Chicago we were working with. And the coaches would come to Leanne and say, well, I got a group of teachers, I got a group of second grade teachers in a study group, and they're having some problems with their guided reading. And you got any good video on second grade guided reading, and that really illustrates this particular kind of strategy? And we had been investing a fair amount in collecting video and art, student work and commentary on this video. And so Leanne actually had a kind of wall of stuff behind her. And she could go to it and pull down a bunch of things and clip this stuff together and, produce something. But, this obviously just doesn't scale. But this was a common problem in tailoring professional development at the school building level around problems that a group of teachers or maybe a particular new teacher was confronting. And so the question was, well, could we use technology to help here? Well, what if we created a multimedia library that had these video resources and commentary on the video resources and that had examples of the student work? So build this asset base and then create a set of tools that we could actually give to a staff developer. So you could easily sort through this, find the various video clips because they're deeply indexed, be able to move these things around, look at little clips of these, figure out which of these things you want to use, further clip them so you can put them together because sometimes you've got a 2-hour session, sometimes you've got 30 minutes. But make it very easy for staff developers to do what Leanne did. And we're now field testing that. We'll have this in 50 schools this year. We're doing a randomized field trial where we're actually asking questions. This will be a 4 years randomized field trial. If we give this kind of tools to staff developers, are they actually more productive in their work? Does it change the kind of teacher learning that occurs in schools? And ultimately, does it lead to is there any evidence that makes a difference for student learning? So we've got a 4-year randomized field trial that's actually trying that out. And we have a 40-school use study where we've deliberately gone into a very wide range of schools where coaches are working under very different conditions. We're really asking questions about how well do these tools work. This is really the kind of software and hardware. What has to be in the context for this kind of tool to actually be taken up and used well, because that will reshape subsequent engineering of the tool as we begin to get experience with this in a large number of contexts. But it's an example of taking teachers' work, in this case staff developers' work, seriously, asking how technology can help, and being committed to a kind of engineering orientation. We're going to try some stuff, we're going to figure out where it works and where it doesn't, and we're going to go back and re-engineer it, try to make it work better. And we're doing this, I would add, in collaboration with a commercial partner. So we've got a set of schools we're working with that are associated with the Literacy Collaborative, and we have a commercial partner, Teachscape, who's actually supporting it's their platform that we're developing on. Another closely related priority. Can we make the systems that support teacher learning more efficient and effective? Again, the core of schools is the quality of our teachers. Are there ways we can make the ways we develop teachers more effective? The school districts are now investing very large amounts of money in professional development programs. And much of the design of these programs, this is also true for pre-service education, is largely guided by expert professional judgment. We think this will work. can we complement this with a dynamic evidence base capable of supporting continuous improvement in this domain? This is what I call the causal cascade problem. Well, think about this. Well, it starts with the intentional design of some professional education program. Someone goes out and figures out, decides, this is what we think we should do with this group of teachers. When we look at most of these programs, however, we need to get a lot clearer about what is it exactly we expect teachers to learn if we put them through this experience, and how do we know whether or not they learned it? We'd ask those questions about students. We design lessons for students, and we teach teachers to what is it we want our children to learn, and how do we know whether or not they learned it? But we don't do the same thing when we shift to designing educational programs for adults. We tend to tolerate a fair amount of ambiguity about what is it they're actually supposed to learn, and what's the evidence they got it. Second part of the causal cascade, assuming that some knowledge and skill has been acquired, does this actually translate into observable changes in classroom practice? People went through some professional education program. They supposedly learned some things. Can I see it in the differences in instruction that occur in the classroom? Because if they can learn some things, but it doesn't change what they do in the classroom, it dies there. And so that's the second part of the causal cascade. And the third part is assuming they got the knowledge and skills, and assuming we can there's a link to what changes in actual classroom practice, does it make a difference in terms of the learning gains that students actually achieve in those classrooms? Because that ultimately is what it's all about. Now, we have in our research enterprise, we have people who study student learning, and we have people who design professional development programs, and some people who study classroom practice. But these things aren't put together. So there isn't a kind of system for gathering evidence and learning from these set of practices that cut across this causal cascade. Yet this is the heart of our business. Try to make this all work better. It's right here. Operating at the macro, the same set of issues operates at the macro organization level. I've already alluded to that about the weaknesses in human resource systems in most public school districts, but that's also manifest in the academy. Where are the human resource system specialists in the schools of education? I mean, I can't give you the name of one person who does this. I don't mean just here. I mean anywhere who really studies human resource development systems. And if you're the superintendent you just become the superintendent of schools in a big district, and you got a problem, who would I send you to? They're typically not in schools of education, even though it's right at the heart of the problem, human resource development systems. When we think about this inside a school system, I did a fair amount of work with the Chicago public school system around this issue. What we really need, it's a fairly straightforward set of issues, but how do we select staff? In the case of teachers, how do we decide to give them tenure? Hardly anybody even thinks about it. It's a process. Well, we've done it this way. Why do we do it that way? Well, we've always done it that way. Well, do we know whether it actually means we're holding on to our best people? No, we don't know anything about it. Even though it's one of the most important decisions we make. And certainly in the academy, it's one of the important decisions we make, which faculty to give tenure to, but it's a mechanical decision inside of a school system, even though you may be making a 30-year commitment to somebody. But how do we select staff? How do we think about the ongoing professional development for each role? How do we identify talent and promote talent? This is a seemingly obvious part of any HR system. But if you ask the question in a big urban district like Chicago, how do you become a principal, which ought to be thought of as identifying and promoting talent, the story goes something like, well, I've been a teacher for a while. I got kind of tired of being a teacher. I went to a university and I got a certificate that, I got a Type 75. That's what it's called in Illinois to be a principal. So now I'm certified. One of the tests of the quality of these programs is I don't think anybody fails. So, if it's any kind of professional education program, somebody, at least on some occasion, should not make it through. I think that's a pretty modest test of quality. But now they're certified, and again, they're working in systems where loyalty tends to be one of the driving principles. You know somebody who's in the central office and a position opens up and you get promoted to be a principal. This is no way to identify talent and promote talent. And then in that context, thinking about orchestrating a career ladder. Well, if you want to identify and promote talent in a school system, it needs to start with expertise in the classroom teaching children. Individuals who are real good at that, you want to then move them to the next level. You want to put them into a position where they really have some opportunity to work on supporting the learning of other adults, because that's a kind of a staff developer role, of which there are a fairly large number of them. Because schools again are only good as the quality of the people. Developing your people is an essential part of leadership. So you need to know something about teaching children well. You need to develop expertise around adult learning. If you get to that point, then we can think about developing school management leadership programs, how to manage organization, the managerial skills associated with that. And then there's the next big step, which also tends to get underestimated. When you take somebody from a principalship, who's basically his work has been directly working with individuals. I can touch each of the people personally, at least in elementary school. High school is a different situation. And then I move them to a central office. They now have to think policy, because they can't enact improvements just by individually touching each person. And that's a very big conceptual shift. And that's another part of what a career ladder in this field ought to do. This is not rocket science, but it's very hard to find any district that thinks about its people this way. All right. Last observation in this category. Puncturing a myth. Not all promising innovations begin in the academy. Practice innovations rarely spring solely from university research. So there's kind of amalgam of disciplinary knowledge and practical insights. And in some cases, some of the most promising innovations, I would argue, don't start in the academy at all, but they actually start out in practice. Best example of this was the school-based professional learning systems that were pioneered in District 2 in New York, the work of Tony Alvarado and colleagues, which actually started in the district. It was only after it was 6 or 7 years along that the high-performance learning project came along. Dick Elmore, Lauren Resnick, Mary Kay Stein, and then they went out to systematically study this. It was very important because this was an innovation that started in a district that was actually quite promising, and it was subject then to trying to articulate what is the real theory of action so that others can learn from it. We need to do much more work of that sort, but the key point of which is that the innovation actually started out there. It didn't start in the academy. It really started in practice. Another example of that, I think, is some of the distinctive normative environments that you'll find in select charter schools, particularly KIPP academies and Amistad, which are middle schools. They're dealing with very disadvantaged urban children, often students whom, by the time they get them, have developed negative attitudes toward learning. And these schools have an extraordinarily powerful culture. When you see, anybody who goes into them sees it, but the interesting question is not, well, gee, but how do you create it? Well, what are the implications for the kind of people you hire, for the kinds of rules, procedures, the first norming that occurs as new groups of students come in? How do you actually create that culture? Because it's one thing to say this is really terrific. It's another thing to know about what are the essential elements of developing it. Because you're going to develop more schools like that, and you're going to try to take these ideas someplace else. You have to understand deeply the processes by which that kind of culture forms. So that's another good example of one that started in practice, from which, in my view, public schools could learn an enormous amount, but it just sits out there right now. It's not been subject to any kind of systematic inquiry. So this really kind of calls for, again, in this kind of engineering spirit, new forms of research and development. When you find something good, you try to understand what are, in detail, what is the essential elements of these practices, try to get to the underlying theory of action, as well as a critical analysis of its effects, because you need all of this for others to learn from it. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is people go out and see it, they think it's really great, I'm going to go back to my district and do it, and it fails because you don't really understand what you saw. All right. How might such an enterprise to do this kind of work be structured within a research university? This is beginning to talk about a new institutional base here at Stanford. The first of which would be this idea of teaching schools. Again, it goes back to goes back to the work of the Center for Urban School Improvement, our starting charter schools, but this idea that schools of education would be really different places if they ran schools. So the mission of teaching, what I call teaching schools, is obviously we need to educate children well and support well the families of those children. But these should be places where we educate adults, where we engage in pre-service education, continuing professional development of other teachers in nearby districts, and where the senior staff of the school are involved in co-development relationships with faculty at the university, where we're working on identifying problems together and developing, doing this R&D in a real partnership between the teachers of the school and the teachers of the university. This is the Stanford Schools Corporation that we've just set up, and where we will now be, we're already operating a high school, and we'll be beginning to plan, we're planning for 2006 a K-12 elementary school to go with that high school, which will be operated by the School of Education here at Stanford. The second of these rings is the Policy Research Center to Inform Reform, where we're really trying to bring together the best of discipline inquiry with this kind of multi-partisan outreach. This builds on the earlier work of PACE and here at the university with Policy Analysis for California Education and efforts to try to more broadly engage a cross-section of researchers in that activity. And these two wheels look, if you remember my earlier part of my talk, that's the Center for, the wheel on the right is the Center for School Improvement, and the wheel on the left is the Consortium on Chicago School Research. The new part of this, the third part of the Ballantine, is a Center for Leadership for School Improvement. And the mission here is to really root professional education and research and development, create a context in which professional education, research and development, and the problems of managing change could occur. This link between the Graduate School of Business and the School of Education. Collaborate and hopefully built around some form of long-term cooperative agreements, working with districts, working with charter management organizations on these core problems of practice, developing people and the tools, materials, and ideas they work with. So doing this with districts and doing it possibly with charter management organizations. We'll talk a little bit about each of those. The teaching schools. Well, in terms of developing people, the main task of the teaching schools is around developing teachers to teach well in what I would call the hardest of places. In terms of the R&D to support improvement, here, again, we're talking about the tools, materials, and ideas that individuals are working with. The two schools will function for us as critical alpha co-development sites. Faculty at the university will work collaboratively with senior staff at the teachers around a kind of mutually agreed upon agenda. These are the core problems we really need to get better at. Technology integration is clearly going to be one of them. In this context, the whole focus on English language learners, and particularly the problems of academic language acquisition, are really central. We know those two are clearly going to be on the agenda. But there's a range of others that may come on the agenda that we will figure out together with the staff of the schools as we go forward. In terms of the Center for Leadership Improvement in developing people, here we're looking for ways to strengthen the current joint program between GSB and SUSE, and also a program within just the School of Education, PALS program. And both of these programs are really quite special because we tend to attract, a number of you in the room actually, students whom I would call as social entrepreneurs. Certainly when I visited here, the students I met were extraordinary, and an extraordinary part of the pull to come to Stanford, to be able to work with students in programs like this. They were bringing very different kinds of people into leadership positions in education, which is very much needed. This center would also create a context in which we could develop cases and materials for deepening the kind of professional education programs we can run, executive education programs that can be run out of Stanford, and real interest in the possibility, discussion at this point, of could we invent some sort of, Sloan-type program, a intensive one-year program specifically designed for emerging leaders in charter management organizations, in districts, could we build a program that would actually, in this movement, say, for example, from the principalship to a central office position and preparing people for leadership, whether it be in a district or in a charter management organization. So that's an issue that's under discussion. And then the R&D to support this kind of work, the problems of practices, whether it's the startup of new schools, organizational growth of charter management organizations, the human resource development systems. That's the core R&D agenda for such a center. Shifting over to talking about the Policy Research Center, here when we talk about developing people, we have this big press that we should have a more evidence-based practice. Well, we have to develop people to be able to engage in that kind of evidence-based practice. So that's a big part of the human resource development agenda for such a center. In terms of the R&D agenda, part of this agenda is systematically subjecting to inquiry the various policy initiatives that are coming forward, whether it's mandated curriculum, the tutoring programs of No Child Left Behind, this rapid immersion of new small schools, the charter school movement. The policy system is constantly generating initiatives that need systematic inquiry. Much of what we know about so much of these things is basically what school systems tell us about the efficacy of their initiatives. Well, it's just a little bit like, taking the advertising on TV as being some indication of what is or isn't happening with regard to a reform. These things merit systematic inquiry. This is too important to get this right. Part of what such a center would do would be actually to build, again, like we do with the consortium, to build these large-scale integrated databases to make such inquiry easier to occur in the future, and also hopefully to be an agent that might, in addition to studying things that someone else has put in place, to actually maybe getting a little bit ahead of the curve and actually designing field studies of promising innovations and getting some evidence about their effectiveness before they become policy. So trying to push on that idea of designing large-scale field studies. Particularly in this latter regard, the Policy Center, just a few observations. When we think about academic policy research, there's kind of got to step back from that a little bit, and there's a question that I think is frequently not asked. What's the proper role of applied social science inquiry in social problem solving in a democratic society? What role should we play in this kind of activity? Currently, I would argue that this is a highly contentious enterprise, and it's highly contentious for good reasons. Unfortunately, with much of this field, if you know the researcher who's doing the work, there's a good chance you know what he or she is going to conclude before they've done the study, and that this is more akin to policy advocacy than anything that looks like kind of disciplined inquiry. And that's a problem for our field. This is not just education. This is more broadly this whole field. So I think that it's important to kind of step back and think about how we ought to orient ourselves to doing this kind of work. As I thought about this in the context of the work we did in the building the consortium on Chicago school research, we took a great deal of our inspiration from the public philosophy of John Dewey, Benjamin Barber, and Charles Lindblom. And there's a line of argument in this public philosophy about the relationship of applied social science to social problem solving, that this relationship is best conceived in a democratic society as an educative one. In the broadest sense, we should take our mission, I think about policy research and education, as public education about the improvement of public education. It goes back to the issue before about civic engagement. We have to help the public understand better what are the real issues in the improvement of public education. That's an appropriate role for applied social science. A democratic vision of policymaking, and to embrace this kind of democratic vision of policymaking as basically one of a competition of ideas, where the academic's role in this competition of ideas is to inform the competition of ideas with the best possible evidence and ways of thinking about the evidence, but not trying necessarily to tell people that my way of thinking about the evidence is the right way, because that is something that properly belongs in this pluralist democratic politics itself. Drawing on observations from other evaluation theorists, we need to embrace the kind of ethical responsibility to seek out actively the diverse interests operating around any school reform initiative and to assure that a wide range of questions are continually addressed. The research agenda should not be beholden to any one group, and the activity should be socially structured to be deliberately multi-partisan. Going back to the work I did on the consortium on Chicago school research, as we initiated that work, and there was this decentralization reform that created these local school councils, we deliberately created around the research enterprise the stakeholder group, whom we met with every 6 weeks. We did this for 14 years. And that group was deliberately designed to be multi-partisan. So I had the architects of the decentralization reform, Don Moore and Fred Hess, and I had Barbara Sizemore, who thought this was the absolute worst thing you could do to reform a public school system. And I had the people in the school system there at the table too, and others. Those were the particular extremes on that particular point in time. And we deliberately put the research enterprise right in the middle of this social context because I needed to know how these various actors thought about this reform, because it would shape the questions we should ask about, is this reform actually working? We did the same thing when Paul Vallis took over the school system in 1995 and introduced a whole set of high-stakes accountability initiatives, including an end of social promotion and a grade retention initiative. We had leadership of the school system was convinced this was absolutely the right way to transform this. And in this case, I had on the other side now Don Moore, who thought this was the absolute worst thing you could do to kids in an urban district. And we constructed a research agenda that not only looked at questions about were the test scores going up, which were the questions the school district were raising, but Don Moore raising a whole set of questions about, well, yeah, but what do those numbers really mean? Aren't we really introducing into this system a whole set of perverse disincentives that ultimately will come due? So we did studies like, is there evidence that teacher cheating is going up? Which, yes, we did find. You put enough pressure on the system, cheating will increase. Is this really evidence that's, because the test scores did go up. We documented that. Is there really evidence that that this learning is deep, or is there some gaming of the test going on? So we undertook a whole set of studies, including looking at, often kids in urban districts don't complete the test. One way to game the test is to tell kids to randomly bubble in the items at the end of the test, because there's no penalty for guessing on any of these national norm reference tests. So even if you just write, a string of A's or a string of B's, your chances are 1 in 4 you're going to get the item right, and so the test scores go up. So we analyzed the test score strings, and lo and behold, we sure found that as soon as the high-stakes accountability went in, the number of incomplete test score strings dropped dramatically. But that's the kind of thing where you're building the research agenda out of being deliberately multi-partisan, rather than just simply reporting what the system wanted reported. The test scores were going up. All right, so being deliberately multi-partisan, that ethic then also has to be counterbalanced with a steadfast commitment to technical quality, undergirding the conceptualization, design, and the actual conduct of the research. Well, ideas from various stakeholders infuse the questions that get asked. We also consulted with people broadly once we started to get the data back in and we're starting to interpret what these data mean. We're also trying to get the multiple interpretations of the data out in front of people so that we can see how others will react to this. So while we do that, at the core of the process, we're doing disciplined inquiry. And we're doing disciplined inquiry in the most rigorous form. Because when the day is done, if we don't do that, we have nothing special to say. We're just a single actor in a democratic polity trying to push for a particular view of what should happen next. It's the only reason why applied social science has any kind of claim to authoritativeness in a democratic polity. Finally, we're also a certain humbleness required about what all of this should accomplish. That while we think about research as having instrumental uses, we find something, the policy process takes it in and changes what they do as a result of what we learn. That's what we call instrumental use. And that happens on some occasions. In some cases, the much more powerful contribution we make is we don't get the instrumental use, but over time we gradually reshape the conceptualizations that people work with as they think about the problems of practice and their improvement, and that refocuses the policy debate. That is, and it refocuses that debate hopefully toward a more coherent, empirically grounded theory of action. People understand better the problems they're trying to solve. All right. Finally, in doing this kind of work, it's especially important to be clear about our ethics of practice. I don't think we do a good job teaching it, and it's just not very common in the practice itself. That we have to be very attuned to the fact that we have strong biases about all these things. We're all educated. We all went through schools. We all now, most of us have some sort of professional career as well, so we have some beliefs that come by virtue of our personal background. We have some things we think we know by virtue of our professional work, and we have to be very clear to distinguish that from what I can objectively warrant with some body of empirical evidence, whereby objectively, I mean that process I've described before of consulting broadly around a set of questions, doing discipline inquiry, making that inquiry open to others, to look over our shoulder as we're doing it, making the data available to others. Those are the processes, the social processes, that in some sense objectify. It's not the technical details, but it's this set of social arrangements around the doing of research that creates something like an objective warrant. And this is hard and sometimes uncomfortable work. Again, going back to the end of the social promotion initiative in Chicago, this was something about which I personally had a very strong view, that this was a bad thing to do, especially with regard to young children. I mean, the end of social promotion initiative was based on this idea that we had to create incentives for kids to work harder. But when you think about a promotional gate at third grade, I would argue personally that when kids fail at grade 3, it's not because the kids aren't working hard. The adults have failed, not the kids. But we had a promotional gate at grade 3. That was the system's policy. They had some arguments about why they thought it would work. We had to take those arguments seriously. And we had to subject this to discipline inquiry. And because I knew I had my own personal views about this, I became extremely careful to make sure I brought in other people who had somewhat different views about this. So we brought in some microeconomists. You know, microeconomists love incentives. They think every problem can be solved with incentives. So we brought some people into the work who said there's incentives in this thing that's really going to make it work. So, all right, well. But the point is that these things are very powerful in doing the work. And unless we're real clear about that and we build systems to protect ourselves from ourselves, it's very hard to get high-quality evidence that can really inform these conversations. All right, anyway, bringing this all to a close, putting it all together, developing the people, tools, materials, ideas, and evidence with which they work. Thinking about these 3 domains of work, teaching schools, a leadership center, a policy research center. Each of these has a set of practitioners who are our immediate focus. The teaching schools working with teachers, the leadership center with managers, district CMO leaders, policy research center, in some sense focusing with analysts, but also individuals and groups that are engaged in outreach to civic elite. And then in addition to that direct work with what I would call our practitioners, we're also very interested in a kind of renewed professorate. In addition to being able to do this kind of work here, we want to be able to teach others to do this work in other places. Why we do doctoral education, whether it be individuals going into teacher education programs, leadership and management programs, policy research programs at other institutions. This is no small agenda. It really is a call for institutional leadership, and I'm reminded of a long-standing observation from Montesquieu. Under ordinary circumstances, institutions shape leaders. But at times of structural change, and we are certainly in one of those times, the reverse is true. Leaders create institutions. This is a unique opportunity for Stanford to lead. In this case, to reinvent how universities support this most critical and human of social endeavors, the improvement of education for all of our children. You know, for me personally, why I came to Stanford, because this institution values both serious scholarship, kind of hard work one needs to do to learn about these various things, but it also values the essential engineering work involved in transforming this scholarship into usable knowledge that can improve human affairs. This is a university